talk to now Dr. Paul to find out what he makes of it all. Political correctness, of course, being blamed now for Islamic extremism being downplayed by the Prevent organisation. Paul, a very good afternoon to you. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Mike.
So good to talk to you about this, because this is something which I think we don't talk about enough. We've seen, obviously, the various different problems that Prevent have had. We've seen the Fishmongers Hall episode where the Prevent client, if you like, was thought to be, deemed to be de-radicalised, thought it was okay to let him out on his own, come down on a train with his laptop, go to Fishmongers Hall, produce knives and start stabbing people at random. Similarly, the killer of David Amess MP. It's not been run very well, I think, is probably the most generous way I can think of describing it.
I think that's a fair comment, Mike. And I mean, the first thing to say, this Prevent review has been a very long time in gestation. It was way back in 2019 this was first mooted, and William Shawcross submitted the independent review back in April last year. And there seems to have been a fair old ding-dong within the Home Office about the content. What it basically does is bring a bit of clarity to the type of issues you've already mentioned in your trailer.
Yeah.
The focus on Prevent needs to be reset. It's gone awry from what's the core threat to the country, which is Islamist extremism. Last year, the head of the security service, MI5, gave a speech and he said, I think 75% of the terror plots that MI5 interrupted and were monitoring were Islamist in their origin.
Yes.
I think in the Shawcross report, it talks about 80%, a very similar figure. Now, you might think from that 75, 80% of the people who Prevent are working with, who they're trying to deter from supporting terrorism, are Islamists. Actually, the figure is down now, I think, to around about 16%. And indeed, the largest percentage of people who are referred to Prevent are people who are classed as vulnerable but not possessing counter-terrorism risk. So what you basically have here is, as Shawcross outlines, people who've got mental health issues or various concerns and who are being referred to Prevent so they can get mental health support. It's turned into a sort of social service rather than something to counter terrorism, which is what it was originally designed to be. We need a reset.
Well, exactly. And it seems as though, as Shawcross points out, that there's been an awful lot of kind of well-intentioned, shall we say, intervention, but it hasn't really been the right kind of intervention, and it might well be that there's reasons for that. It could be that the civil service is not fit for purpose when it comes to this kind of thing. We know from other areas of public sector working that, you know, there's a great squeamishness around anything to do with the Muslim community. There's a great squeamishness about Islam. You know, people don't want to hear certain things. They don't want to look into certain, you know, dark corners in case they don't like what they find.
Well, I think we saw that in 2021 with the Battle of Grammar school teacher, poor bloke still in hiding, and we also...
Yeah, I mean, that's extraordinary. How is that possible that this bloke is still in hiding in fear of his life?
It's a scandal, Mike, and it should be raised and raised and raised until the conditions that allow that to occur no longer exist. It's a great scandal. But we also had in 2022 a series of cinema protests around the question of blasphemy, mobs outside cinemas protesting against a film that was considered blasphemous by a small number of British Muslims. And one of the great strengths of the Shawcross report is he actually raises blasphemy. And this is an issue which, as you say, civil servants and others in the public sector want to shy away from, want to brush under the carpet. When we had these cinema protests, for example, there was very little to be seen in the way of policing or pushback from politicians. And Shawcross rightly raises the fact that there's clearly a terrorism threat if somebody is in hiding for fear of having their head chopped off.
Well, exactly right. And also you make the point in your piece in the Telegraph today that Shawcross understands the relevance of ideology, because ideology very much drives these ideas. I mean, I was listening to somebody ringing into another radio station this morning who had actually been through the Prevent programme, and he said he was kind of recommended to it because he was part of a group of kids in a particular school, and I think it was in or around London, who had become sort of collectively radicalised, and they were actively considering going out to join ISIS. They were actively having conversations in classrooms about the possibility of jihad against, you know, Britain. So it was a fascinating sort of insight into the kinds of people and the kinds of things that are going on in our society that we don't seem to want to address.
No, and I mean, there are clear examples such as the ones you cite where the type of intervention that Prevent does can work or can make a difference rather than, simply looking to prosecute every single person who's perhaps young and daft or young and confused. I think one problem, though, is certainly within the education system, there's been a lot of resistance to Prevent, for example, from the teachers' union, from the university lecturers' union, and the governments and the authorities need to get out and explain the case for Prevent. They need to counter some of the arguments, the conspiracy theories, some of the criticisms of it, because otherwise, what's the point in the review? The whole thing will just die and wither unless we get some clarity, unless we get some honesty about the type of threats that the country faces. Politicians can't hide, and they can't allow themselves to be pushed around by their civil servants. No,
and Isabel Oakeshott made the point this morning that in Prevent's kind of approach, which Shawcross has been very clear to highlight, their sort of misadventures in approaching the right extremism is that they look at people, even like her and myself, as kind of people that fuel right-wing extremism, which of course is very far from the truth. But what they don't do is then look at the sorts of things that are fueling Islamic extremism and asking questions to those people.
Yes, Shawcross is very clear that the sort of the capture for the far right is extremely broad, whereas for Islamists they don't really seem Prevent's training packages, for example, and some of its internal literature seemed confident only when talking about Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. It doesn't seem to want to go much broader than that. Whereas when in some of its material looking at people supposedly on the far right, it seems to take in quite mainstream views, for example, pro-Brexit views. There was an organisation, Turning Point UK, for a while that Dominic Samuels from Manchester was involved in, and that appeared in Prevent literature as an example of the far right. She's a black woman from Manchester.
Right.
You know, the far right's changed quite a lot if it's accepting black people.
Well, exactly right.
This is the sort of mess Prevent's got itself into, and it needs to change, and Shawcross offers a route out of that.
Yes, which brings us nicely to the case of Shamima Begum, doesn't it? Because she has become this kind of celebrity figure almost, thanks to, I think, a bit of misplaced interest from some sections of the media. She is another one who came from that sort of background of a community in Britain which was obsessed in many ways with ISIS, where lots of young people who were, shall we say, I don't know, disenfranchised for whatever reason from where they were living, suddenly thought it'd be a great idea to go and join up with this terrible, awful death cult in the Middle East. I mean, it really does beg a belief that, you know, she's now being looked upon as a kind of sympathetic figure.
Well, I think we've got currently, we've just had the 10-part BBC podcast on Shamima Begum. I'm wondering whether the sort of cookery programme or travel log is going to appear.
Well, strictly, you know, why not?
Next, yes, that's the logic of it. I haven't seen as much attention necessarily focused, or certainly in recent times, to some of the victims of Islamic State, or indeed to the ongoing work that the Kurds are doing, often much of the heavy lifting in terms of opposing Islamist organisations, such as Islamic State's various remnants. That's where we should be focused, rather than on this rather silly person who's taken a lot of bad decisions and now needs to lie in the bed that she's made.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, I take it you don't harbour those thoughts that some do, that she should be brought back to Britain to face a court of some kind?
Well, unfortunately, in this country, we've got an absolutely pitiful record, certainly over the past couple of years, of prosecuting people who've gone out to join Islamic State. If there was a realistic prospect and if there was a sense of will within the Crown Prosecution Service and other structures to prosecute and potentially gain a conviction, I might have some sympathy for that view, but I don't think it's going to happen. You also have to remember, I think Sajid Javid was the Home Secretary at the time, and he was given quite a detailed dossier on this woman and her activities, and he was very firm she poses a threat to our security. I'm quite happy at the moment to go with Sajid Javid's view.
I think that's absolutely right. And finally, Paul, I suppose we ought to address the other sort of elephant in the room, which is the dinghies that arrive constantly on the shores of this country. We were told at the beginning of this week that there seems to be some evidence that at least some of those are coming from Afghanistan with links to the Taliban. Many people, of course, don't know who they are. The Border Force people don't seem to know who a lot of these people are. I mean, Prevent doesn't, I think, have a role in any of that, but it should, shouldn't it?
Yes, one of Shawcross's recommendations is that the immigration authorities that working with Prevent should be a statutory duty. So in other words, they're committed to the policy and to utilising it. I think that's necessary. I think, though, there's a much broader question here that we've seen for some time now to be allowing an enormous number of very often young men into the country about whom comparatively little is known. And that is a threat to our security. Indeed, one of the things in the Shawcross review is the number of cases where people have come into the country. The Reading jihadists who killed 3 gay men in a park in Reading is one example. The Parsons Green bomber on the tube who watched his attack is another. These are people who've entered the country claiming asylum, who've committed all sorts of crimes, been very problematic when they're here, and we can't seem to get rid of them. And that is the big challenge in security terms facing the government. And it's also a challenge in electoral terms. The Tories don't deserve to be re-elected if they can't resolve this.
No, because it surely seems to be a lot simpler than they're making it. You know, there are ways that they could stop things happening, but they don't seem to. They keep saying they're going to. I don't know whether you think Rishi Sunak has got a better plan than anybody else has had.
Well, time will tell. We've heard big talk before, and for a whole variety of reasons, it hasn't happened. It's pretty much the last chance saloon, and it's noticeable. Although a lot of weight seems to be going around leaving the European Court of Human Rights, it is noticeable that some other countries who are members of that institution are far better, are often far quicker at expelling people who shouldn't be in the country. So the French and the Italians are both examples of that. France, for example, will deport people back to Algeria. The UK hasn't for many years.
No, indeed. Dr. Paul Stott, great to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Head of Security and Extremism Unit at the Policy Exchange, a think tank